Hey family, it's me, Erin Wurtenberg. If you don't know me, I'm a wife and a mama and a friend and a sister and a daughter. I'm also a therapist. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I provide mental health treatment to individuals with severe and persistent mental illness who also happen to be incarcerated. So that's what I do, and one of the things I wanted to share with you now that we're in Mental Health Awareness Month is the idea that words matter. And what I wanted to share with you is something that I try to encourage a lot of my patients in. And it can be a real challenge because a lot of my patients have been institutionalized for much of their lives, even if they're only 22 or 27 years old. They've been labeled and categorized as a particular handicap or deficit or problem. Many of them from the beginning of their lives, right? Problem child. That child's just oppositionally defiant. And I try to encourage them that yes, you may be experiencing symptoms of a mental illness that may be quite debilitating at times. But if we can, as a society, especially as a church community, if we can learn to use language that in the field we call person-centered, it really is a game changer in terms of how you look at people and interact with people. And what it looks like is this. Instead of saying, he's a depressive or she's a schizophrenic, you use language like this. He's an individual who's experiencing depression. She's an individual who seems to be having features of schizophrenia. Now, some might argue and say, well, that's just semantics. But I really believe that it's this way of looking at people is how God sees us. God sees us as his own, as his kiddo, as golden, not as the broken, the way that we see ourselves, right? Broken, addicted, obsessed, compulsive. But he says, you're my kiddo, and you happen to be experiencing these things. I personally have dealt with bouts of depression, definitely anxiety. And so I think there have been times where I myself have said, well, I'm just a melancholy, depressed, lonely loser, or whatever the self-insult du jour might have been. But to change the language, and we even use this when we're talking about people that, we used to call mentally retarded. We don't use that language anymore. We've learned to say individuals who have an intellectual disability, right? Because first and foremost, you're a human being. And I want to speak that to those of you who are, maybe you really are wrestling with what might be a diagnosis, what might be just more of a situational, emotional or mental struggle that you're having right now. Maybe it's an addiction. I mean, it can be really tricky because in our society, we really, really we love to categorize people and put labels on people. And even in our own recovery programs, we found that it's helpful to label. And I think there is some benefit to saying, for example, like with the 12-step program culture, it is really helpful to admit, hey, I'm an addict and I don't have control over this. And not but I'm also an individual, first and foremost, made in God's image. I'm an individual, for example, who happens to really struggle with alcohol. I'm an individual who happens to really, really battle feelings of wanting to overeat or overexercise or go to church a little too much, or, you know, be obsessive about reading scripture and saying prayers over and over to a point where it's impacting my life negatively, right? I'm an individual first and foremost. So if we can start to see ourselves that way, and then see how that overflows and how we see others, I think one of the easiest ways to do that is to check our language and how we're talking about folks that happen to experience mental illness or addiction or even poverty, right? Like we talk about like, oh, that homeless dude over there. What does that even mean? There are college students, there are university students who happen to be homeless, who are living in their cars. So I think it's much more grace-filled to use that person-centered language. Again, starting with ourselves and then letting that overflow into our communities. So we would use language such as he's an individual who's currently experiencing homelessness. So I encourage you to kind of check your language and see how you talk about other people and also how you're talking about yourself over the next few weeks as we're in Mental Health Awareness Month.